The snow had been falling for hours, a constant barrage of white that covered the world in an icy silence. The wind howled, biting through the layers of clothing, numbing fingers and toes. In the middle of this winter wasteland, a small figure moved slowly, her footsteps muffled by the thick snow. She was weak, her body thin and frail, barely able to carry the weight of her own sorrow. Her long brown hair hung in messy tangles, the edges frozen from the biting cold. Her red sweater was torn, its fabric barely hanging together, and her small hands clutched a faded teddy bear to her chest. Her eyes, filled with the sadness of a child far too young to carry such burdens, scanned the horizon as if searching for something. Someone. The little girl was alone, abandoned. She paused, wiping the frozen tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, the snow catching on her eyelashes. Her breath came in short, labored gasps, her chest tightening from both the cold and the aching emptiness that had lodged itself in her heart. But there was still a glimmer of hope, something in her, some spark that refused to die, no matter how much the world tried to extinguish it. In the distance, the sound of crunching snow reached her ears, faint but steady. She froze, listening intently. Out of the white blur of the storm, a figure emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a camouflage military uniform. His face was haggard, a man weathered by both battle and time. His steps were deliberate, the weight of his exhaustion clear in every movement. Behind him, a large German Shepherd K9 trotted through the snow, its fur matted with ice and snow, its eyes sharp, scanning for danger. The soldier's gaze softened when he saw her, and he paused, taking in the sight of the little girl standing alone in the snow, clutching her teddy bear. Her eyes met his, a silent plea for help in their depths. "Are you alone?" he asked, his voice rough from the cold, but gentle. His eyes searched hers, trying to read the fear and uncertainty behind her tears. The little girl nodded, a soft, almost imperceptible movement, as if the weight of her words might be too much to bear. Her lips trembled, and she took a step forward, hesitantly. "Please, mister," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Can I clean your house for a plate of leftovers?" The soldier blinked, taken aback by the question. For a moment he didn't know how to respond. A child, in the middle of a storm, asking for food. It wasn't a request he was used to hearing, not after everything he had seen, and yet there was something in her innocence, something that reached into the deepest parts of him. His heart clenched, and he knelt down slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "I don't have much," he said, his voice gruff but steady. "But I'll share what I have." The little girl's eyes lit up for a moment, the first sign of hope she had shown since he had arrived. But the soldier could see the wariness in her gaze. She wasn't used to kindness. She had been alone for too long. Before he could say anything more, the girl took a cautious step toward him, her hand outstretched as if she wasn't quite sure whether to trust him. "I'm not going to hurt you," the soldier said softly, holding out his hand. "Come with me. We'll find somewhere safe." The girl hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking from his face to the K9, who sat obediently beside him, its fur glistening with the snowflakes that had settled on its back. Finally, with a soft sniffle, she stepped closer, her small hand meeting his, trembling but determined. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she murmured, looking down at her teddy bear, her voice so small that it almost disappeared into the wind. The soldier's heart broke for her. He gently pulled her into the warmth of his coat, his hand steady on her back. "You're safe now," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. Before they could move any farther, the K9 barked sharply, its body tensing as it turned toward the trees. The soldier straightened, alert. He could hear it too, footsteps. Someone else was coming. He crouched low, his rifle already in hand. "Get down," he ordered softly, his tone sharp with urgency. The girl obeyed, ducking down behind the soldier, her teddy bear held tightly in her arms. The K9's growl rumbled deep in its chest as it prowled forward, ready to protect them both. The soldier watched the approaching figures, his senses sharpened. Keen's men. He had known they wouldn't let him slip away so easily. They were always one step behind. Before we begin, let me know where you are watching from. Leave your country name in the comments below, and if you love stories about courage, loyalty, and community, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. The soldier's fingers tightened on his rifle. He couldn't let them take the girl. Not now. Not when she was finally starting to trust him. He had to protect her, no matter what. A moment of stillness passed, and then the first of Keen's men emerged from the trees, stepping into the clearing with a confident stride. "Don't move!" the soldier warned, his voice low and dangerous. Keen's men paused, their eyes narrowing as they saw the soldier and the little girl. "You think you can run forever?" one of them sneered. "You won't make it out alive." The soldier didn't reply. Instead, he motioned for the girl to stay behind him. His eyes never left the approaching enemy, his heart racing with the knowledge that the fight was about to begin. The little girl's voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to shatter the soldier's resolve. "Please don't send me back." The words were so soft, so heartbreaking, that they pierced the soldier's heart. This was her greatest fear, to be taken from the only safety she had found, to be abandoned once again. The soldier's jaw clenched as he raised his rifle, ready to protect her at all costs, but in the back of his mind he could still hear her words, and he knew, deep down, that the battle ahead was far more than just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the promise he had made to keep her safe. The tension in the air was thick, and Mark's pulse raced as Keen's men closed in. His rifle was steady in his hands, but his mind was focused entirely on the girl behind him, on keeping her safe. She had already lost so much, and he wasn't about to let her lose more. Her soft whisper still echoed in his mind. "Please don't send me back." The words shattered his already fragile resolve. She was no longer just a stranger, no longer just a scared child in the snow. She was his responsibility now. Her safety, her future, rested in his hands. Mark's eyes locked onto the approaching soldiers, 3 of them, all heavily armed. The leader, a tall man with a cruel smile, stepped forward, his eyes scanning Mark's every movement. Keen wasn't far behind, his men like shadows, always lurking. "Looks like you've found yourself a little friend, Sergeant," the leader sneered. His voice was mocking, and Mark could hear the satisfaction in his tone. He was enjoying this. "I'm not here to talk," Mark growled, stepping slightly to the side to shield the girl further. Keen's man chuckled, a cold, low sound that sent a chill down Mark's spine. "I think you're mistaken. You don't get a say in this. She's coming with us. All you have to do is stand aside." Mark tightened his grip on the rifle. "Not a chance." Rex, the K9, growled, the sound deep and menacing, its teeth bared as it stood alert beside Mark. The dog had already sensed the danger. Mark knew that the dog would do anything to protect the girl. He could see the same fierce loyalty in Rex's eyes, the same bond that connected them. They were a team. "You really think you can take us?" Mark's voice dropped to a deadly whisper, his stance firm and unwavering. The soldier laughed again. "You're outnumbered, Sergeant. And you've got a kid to worry about." He nodded toward Maya, who had shrunk further behind Mark, her tiny hands clutching her teddy bear like it was her last piece of hope. "She stays behind me," Mark said firmly. The soldier raised an eyebrow, his amusement shifting into annoyance. "That's a shame," he said, the threat lingering in his words. "I don't think you'll be able to stop us." Mark didn't move an inch, his eyes locked on the soldier, calculating his next move. He had no illusions about the situation. He was outgunned, and their escape route had already been cut off by the men circling them. "Stay calm," he told himself. "Stay focused." He could hear the faintest rustle of snow in the distance. His instincts flared. More men were closing in. He didn't have much time. With one swift motion, Mark stepped to the side and fired. The shot was precise, too quick for the soldier to react. He collapsed to the ground, his weapon slipping from his hand. But there was no time to celebrate. The remaining soldiers immediately took cover behind trees and debris, their weapons raised. Rex moved into position without being told. The dog was fast, its muscles coiled, ready to strike at any moment. It darted toward the nearest soldier, its bark cutting through the storm. The second soldier aimed at Mark, but before he could fire, Rex lunged, knocking the soldier to the ground with a sharp yelp. The soldier scrambled, trying to break free, but Rex's jaws clamped down on his arm, pinning him in place. Mark didn't hesitate. He fired again, hitting the third soldier, who had taken cover behind a fallen log. The soldier went down, his rifle tumbling to the snow-covered ground. The sound of gunfire rang out in the quiet forest, the deafening cracks echoing in the distance. Mark moved quickly, his eyes scanning the area for any other threats. The storm was getting worse, the wind picking up and blurring the line of sight. It was only a matter of time before more soldiers arrived. "You should have stayed down," Mark muttered under his breath, approaching the downed soldier. But the soldier wasn't finished yet. With a final desperate lunge, he grabbed Mark's ankle, pulling him down to the snow. Pain shot through Mark's leg, but before the soldier could do any more damage, Rex sprang into action, sinking his teeth into the man's arm. The soldier screamed, releasing his hold on Mark. Mark kicked him away, pushing himself to his feet and aiming his rifle once more. "You're done," he said coldly, firing the final shot. The soldier collapsed into the snow, unmoving. But it wasn't over yet. The wind had picked up, and the storm was still howling, making it difficult to see anything beyond a few yards. The sound of more footsteps reached Mark's ears. He couldn't tell how many, but he knew Keen wouldn't let him leave without a fight. He turned to Maya, who was standing just behind him, her eyes wide with fear, but still full of hope. She had seen him fight, had seen him protect her, and for the first time since they had met, she trusted him completely. He reached out to her, his voice soft but firm. "Stay behind me," he ordered, as he kept a careful eye on the approaching figures. Maya clutched her teddy bear tighter, her small body trembling. But she nodded, stepping closer to him. Mark's heart twisted. "I can't fail her," he thought, looking down at the little girl who had become his world in the span of a few days. "I won't fail her." Suddenly a shout cut through the wind. Mark's eyes snapped back to the forest, and there he was, Keen. The tall, imposing figure was emerging from the trees, his face twisted in a smirk. "I warned you."
"Sergeant," Keen called out, his voice carrying in the wind, "this was never going to end well." Mark's grip on his rifle tightened. The fight wasn't over yet, and this time there was no escape. Before Mark could respond, Maya's soft voice whispered from behind him, "Please don't send me back." Mark turned slowly, his eyes filled with the same determination that had kept him alive all these years. He bent down and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I won't," he promised. "I swear it." The air was thick with tension. Keen was close now, and Mark could feel the weight of the promise he had made to Maya. He couldn't afford to lose her, not now, not ever. As Keen's men closed in, Mark knew that this was the moment that would decide everything. The wind howled through the trees, but it wasn't the storm that froze Mark's blood. It was the figures emerging from the shadows, closing in on them like a nightmare taking form. Keen's men were here, more of them this time, their faces hidden beneath snow-dusted hoods and the cold indifference of soldiers used to tracking their prey. Mark's eyes locked onto Keen's, cold, calculating, with that same smirk that made Mark's blood boil. The storm seemed to pause in that moment, the air growing still, as if even nature knew something terrible was about to unfold. Maya, still behind him, was clutching her teddy bear tightly. He could feel her small fingers trembling against his back, a silent plea for safety, for protection.
She was too young to understand the full extent of the danger, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would shape the rest of her life. "Time to surrender, Sergeant," Keene called out, his voice carrying through the snow. "You're out of options." Mark's heart raced, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't have the luxury of a plan anymore. They were surrounded, the path ahead cut off, the river on one side, the woods on the other. The only thing between him and certain death was the rifle in his hands and his K9, whose growl echoed through the trees like a warning to the men advancing toward them. He turned to Maya, her eyes wide with fear, but also trust. She still believed in him. Mark couldn't let her down. "You have to run, Maya," he whispered urgently, crouching low to meet her gaze. "Get to the trees. Now, don't stop. Don't look back." Maya shook her head, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "I don't want to leave you." "You have to," Mark said, his voice firm but gentle. "I'll be right behind you. I won't let anything happen to you. Just go now." Ruth, still clutching the baby in her arms, stood just behind Mark. She was pale, exhaustion written all over her face, but there was determination in her eyes. She knew the stakes. They all did. "Mark," Ruth started, but he shook his head, cutting her off. "We can't fight."
"All of them, Ruth. Go, we'll regroup later." With one last, fleeting look at Maya, Mark stood up, his rifle raised. His K9, Rex, was already ahead, scanning the area, ready to leap into action at the first sign of danger. Mark could feel the weight of his promise to Maya in his bones. It was the only thing keeping him going, the only thing that mattered anymore. Keene raised a hand, signaling for his men to halt. "You really think you can keep running, Sergeant?" "You're just delaying the inevitable." He smiled, the kind of smile that made Mark's blood boil with rage. "You've made your choice. Now let's see if you can live with it." The K9 barked sharply, its teeth bared in a warning as it moved closer to Mark, its body tense, ready to spring. But the soldiers didn't move. Instead, they raised their weapons, closing the distance between them and Mark. Ruth was already moving, urging Maya toward the trees, the baby still in her arms. Maya didn't want to go, but Ruth's firm grip on her wrist guided her. Mark's heart clenched as he watched them disappear into the shadows of the trees, the only thing that kept him from truly losing hope. "You won't win this, Sergeant," Keene said, his voice cold and mocking. "You're already out of time." Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he focused on the path ahead, his eyes locked on Keene's soldiers, ready for the inevitable confrontation. The rifle felt heavy in his hands, but it was his only weapon, the only thing that could keep them alive. Keene's men spread out in a semicircle, their rifles aimed directly at Mark. He could hear the sound of their breath through the snowstorm, the crunch of boots in the snow. The K9 was moving between them now, its growl deep and threatening. But it wouldn't be enough. There were too many. The air grew thick with tension. Time seemed to stretch out, every second feeling like an eternity as Mark waited for the first move. He could hear Rex growling again, a sharp, warning sound that made the soldiers pause. But Mark couldn't wait any longer. With a sudden movement, he dropped to one knee, firing at the closest soldier. The man went down with a grunt, collapsing into the snow. The other soldiers reacted instantly, raising their rifles, but Mark was already moving, firing again, hitting the second soldier in the chest. Rex lunged, teeth sinking into the arm of the third soldier, forcing him to the ground. The dog's growl was fierce, its body moving with the precision and speed of a well-trained weapon. But even with the K9 fighting at his side, Mark knew it wasn't enough. There were too many soldiers, too many enemies closing in on all sides. Another soldier raised his rifle and fired. Mark heard the crack of the shot before the world around him seemed to slow. He felt the bullet graze his shoulder, the pain sharp and immediate, but he didn't fall. He couldn't. Rex was still fighting, his body a blur
of movement as it tore into the men around them, but Mark could see the K9 was starting to slow. His loyal companion was strong, but even the toughest dogs had their limits. "Fall back," Mark shouted, his voice hoarse, the words forced, through gritted teeth. "Get to the trees now!" Ruth's figure appeared at the edge of the forest, her hand clutching Maya's tightly, the baby still secure in her arms. Mark's heart gave a lurch as he watched them run toward the cover of the woods. They were so close, they had to make it. Mark pushed himself up, ignoring the pain from the bullet wound in his shoulder, his focus entirely on his team's escape. His rifle was steady, but he was starting to lose track of the soldiers around him. He could feel his strength draining, but there was no time to rest. "Go!" he shouted to Ruth, the words ragged with exhaustion. "Don't stop!" But as Ruth and Maya disappeared into the trees, the sound of Keen's voice cut through the storm. "You're all alone now, Sergeant." Mark didn't look back. He didn't have to. He knew this wasn't over. The storm was far from done, and Keen was still out there, ready to bring the fight to him. But Mark had no intention of giving up, not while Maya was still alive, not while there was even a chance to get her to safety. Before he could take another step, the sound of footsteps behind him grew louder. The soldiers were closing in, their guns raised. Mark's heart pounded, but in the back of his mind, he heard Maya's voice, soft and pleading. "Please don't send me back!" The words broke him in a way he couldn't describe. He wouldn't let that happen. Not while he was still breathing. Not while he had any fight left in him. He turned to face them, ready to do whatever it took to keep his promise. Mark's body ached with every breath, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through him as the soldiers advanced. The storm had only gotten worse, snow swirling around them in a thick, suffocating blanket, the wind howling as if the earth itself were urging them to run. But there was no running anymore. He watched as Ruth and Maya disappeared into the trees, the faintest outline of their figures swallowed by the storm. His only focus now was keeping them safe. They couldn't outrun Keen's men forever, but he would give them every chance he could. The K9 was still by his side, moving fluidly, its body coiled with tension. Mark could feel the dog's loyalty, its fierce determination to protect. Rex was ready to fight until his last breath, just as Mark was. They were a team. "I won't let them take you, Maya," he whispered to himself, the promise he had made ringing in his ears. But Keen's voice cut through the wind, sharp and mocking. "You can't protect her forever, Sergeant. You're outnumbered, and you're already wounded." Mark tightened his grip on his rifle, staring down Keen's soldiers as they moved in. His shoulder throbbed, the bullet wound sending sharp waves of pain through him, but he pushed it aside. He didn't have time to be weak. Keen stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Give up. You've done your part. Let her go. This is the last chance you'll get." Mark's jaw clenched. The man before him, tall and cold, had no idea what he was dealing with. Keen had underestimated him, and Mark was going to make sure he regretted it. "No," Mark growled. "I'll never give her up." "Not to you." Keen's lips curled into a cold smile. "So be it." He raised his hand, signaling for his men to close in. Mark moved first, firing a quick shot at the nearest soldier. The man went down, collapsing into the snow with a loud grunt. Mark didn't hesitate. He fired again, this time hitting the second soldier in the chest. But even as the soldiers fell, more came, advancing with calculated precision. Keen's men were trained, and Mark could see it in the way they moved, methodical, efficient, no wasted movement. They were professionals, and he was running out of time. The K9 lunged, its powerful jaws sinking into the leg of one of the soldiers, forcing him to the ground. The soldier screamed, but the dog didn't let go, its body tense and unyielding, protecting its handler, its charge. Mark's heart swelled with pride for the dog, but he couldn't afford to watch. There was still a fight to be had. Fired again, this time hitting a soldier in the shoulder. The man stumbled back, but before he could recover, Mark sprinted forward, using the snowbank as cover, moving with the fluid precision that had been drilled into him over years of combat. But Keen's voice rang out once more. "Enough of this!" He turned to his men, his voice cold, Surround him." No more hesitation. The soldiers obeyed without question, closing in from all directions, hemming Mark in with no chance of escape. Rex, still fighting, took down another soldier, but the dog was slowing now, its movements less fluid, as fatigue began to set in. Mark's heart raced. They were too close to the river, too close to Maya and Ruth. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. He had to protect them, had to keep them safe. "Rex, stay close," Mark shouted. The dog responded immediately, falling back to his side, ready to defend him at all costs. Mark scanned the environment, his mind working quickly to devise a plan. There was no way to fight them all off. His ammo was low, and he was outnumbered. But there was one chance left, one move he hadn't considered until now: the river. If they could make it to the water, they could use it to cover their escape. It was a risky move, but it was their only shot. Mark turned to the K9, his voice low but urgent. "We're going for the river." "Get ready," Rex barked once in response, its eyes focused and alert, its stance ready for the final charge. Mark dashed toward the trees, using the thick trunks for cover, his rifle raised as he kept his focus on the soldiers advancing on him. Keen's men hesitated for a moment, surprised by the sudden movement. It was all Mark needed. He dove into the snow, rolling out of sight, and immediately broke into a sprint toward the river. The soldiers called after him, their footsteps pounding in the snow, but Mark wasn't looking back. His eyes were fixed on the icy water ahead. Rex was beside him, its paws pounding the snow, staying right on his heels. The moment Mark reached the riverbank, he skidded to a stop, nearly slipping on the ice. He glanced at the water, raging and frigid, before turning to the trees where Ruth and Maya had gone. They were still there, still safe for the moment. But Keen's men weren't far behind. Mark could hear them approaching, their voices sharp and cold. They would never stop chasing him, never stop hunting them. But Mark wasn't going to let that happen. He turned back to Rex, who was already crouched, watching the soldiers as they reached the river's edge. Mark's breath was coming in sharp, ragged gasps, but he had no choice. He had to fight, even if it meant everything. One last stand. "Go!" Mark shouted at the K9, and with a burst of energy, Rex leapt into the frigid river, his powerful body cutting through the water like a knife. Mark hesitated for only a moment, then followed. He plunged into the icy water, the cold instantly seizing his muscles, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Maya and Ruth were depending on him. The roar of the river drowned out everything else, the wind, the storm, even the gunfire. Mark struggled against the current, his limbs burning with the cold, but he kept moving, his eyes fixed on the far bank where Ruth and Maya waited. He couldn't let them down. And as he reached the far bank, pulling himself onto the snow-covered shore, he looked back at the river, at the storm that had nearly consumed them all. Maya's words echoed in his mind once more. "Please don't send me back." Mark could only nod, his voice hoarse and filled with determination. "I won't," he promised again. "Not ever." The icy cold of the river clung to Mark as he dragged himself out onto the snow-covered bank. His limbs felt heavy, his body numb from the freezing water, but he didn't stop. There was no time to stop. His eyes scanned the forest, searching for Ruth and Maya. They were there, just ahead. Ruth had already moved to the edge of the trees, keeping the baby close to her chest. Maya stood beside her, still clutching her teddy bear, her eyes wide with fear, but filled with that same unwavering trust in Mark. She believed in him. And in that moment, he had to believe in himself too. Mark stumbled toward them, his breath coming in jagged gasps as he fought against the cold that clung to his skin. The storm was still raging, the wind howling. But it didn't matter. He couldn't let them down, not now, not ever. "Maya, Ruth," he said, his voice hoarse, "get moving." "Now, I'll keep them off you." Ruth nodded without a word, her face pale but resolute. She didn't hesitate. She took Maya's hand and urged her into the trees, moving swiftly but quietly. Mark didn't look back as they disappeared into the woods, knowing that every second counted. The K9, Rex, had already moved ahead, its powerful legs carrying it through the snow as it scanned the area for danger. But Mark knew Keen's men wouldn't be far behind. They had been relentless so far, and there was no reason to think they would stop now. He turned to face the river again, the sound of the current roaring in his ears. The snowstorm was thick, the visibility poor, but he knew they would come. They wouldn't let him go so easily. "Come on," Mark muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Come on." The first soldier appeared from behind the trees, his silhouette barely visible in the swirling snow. He was armed, his rifle raised, but Mark didn't hesitate. He fired first, the shot echoing through the storm, and the soldier collapsed into the snow, his rifle clattering to the ground. Keen's men were close now. He could hear their footsteps crunching through the snow, see their dark forms moving in the distance. More were coming, too many. Mark turned back to the trees, his heart pounding. He needed to buy more time. The last thing he wanted was for Ruth and Maya to get caught in the crossfire. They had to get to safety. But before he could take another step, another soldier appeared, closer this time, his rifle aimed at Mark. The world slowed for a moment as Mark's fingers tightened around his rifle. The soldier fired. Mark felt the sharp pain in his side before he even realized what had happened. The bullet had grazed him, but the shock of it sent him to his knees. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment everything went blurry. But he couldn't afford to fall now. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand. Blood stained the snow beneath him, but it didn't matter. He had one job now, to keep them safe. The soldier took a step forward, ready to fire again, but Mark's rifle was already up, the barrel steady in his hands. He fired once, hitting the soldier square in the chest. The man fell, his body collapsing into the snow. Mark staggered to his feet, his vision swimming with pain, but he pushed through it. The storm roared in his ears, the cold gnawing at his skin, but he couldn't let it stop him. He had to keep moving. He turned to the path leading into the trees where Ruth and Maya were already hidden, waiting for him. They had to be close now. They had to be. But Keen was still out there. Mark could hear him now, his voice cutting through the snowstorm like a knife. "You can't run forever, Sergeant. You've made your choice, and it's time to pay the price." Mark's jaw tightened. Keen's taunts meant nothing to him now. He wasn't afraid of Keen. What he was afraid of was failing the people who were counting on him. He moved again, his rifle raised, eyes scanning the trees. The snow made it difficult to see, but he could hear Keen's men closing in. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold them off. He needed a plan. He needed... A shot rang out from behind him, and Mark felt the searing pain before he heard the shot. He staggered, his side burning with the force of the impact, and for a brief moment his legs buckled beneath him. But he didn't fall. Instead he spun, firing in one fluid motion. The soldier who had shot him went down with a grunt, his body collapsing into the snow. But Mark didn't pause to check the man's vitals. He couldn't afford to. He had one job, to get Maya and Ruth to safety. He turned toward the trees again, but this time his vision blurred with exhaustion. The storm seemed to intensify, the wind howling louder, and Mark felt himself growing weaker with every passing second. The cold was suffocating. His injuries were starting to take their toll. But he pushed through it, his eyes locked on the trees, on the figure of Ruth as she emerged from the shadows. She was running toward him, Maya beside her, the baby still cradled in her arms. Mark's heart soared with relief, but he couldn't let his guard down yet. They weren't safe. Not until they were far, far away from here. He motioned for them to keep moving, his voice hoarse as he yelled, "Keep going! Don't stop!" Ruth nodded, her face pale but determined. "Come on, Maya," she urged, pulling the little girl ahead, her feet slipping in the snow. Maya looked back at Mark one last time, her eyes filled with a question that broke his heart. "Are you coming, Mark?" Mark didn't hesitate. "I'm right behind you," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. As they disappeared into the trees, Mark stood tall, his rifle steady in his hands. He had one last job to do. He would buy them time. He would keep them safe. The sound of Keen's men grew louder, closer, but Mark didn't flinch. He could feel the weight of Maya's plea, the promise he had made to her, driving him forward. He raised his rifle and fired again. Mark could feel the weight of the storm, both in the weather and in the sense of desperation that was settling in his chest. The wind howled, as if nature itself was trying to bury them, the snow, a thick, blinding wall around him. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, each inhalation a reminder of how close the cold had crept into his bones. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. Not while Maya and Ruth were still in danger. His rifle was heavy in his hands, the ammunition running low, but Mark's focus was razor-sharp. He was determined. They would make it. They had to. The crackle of gunfire echoed behind him, and he instinctively ducked into the trees, his back pressed against the cold bark as Rex, his loyal German Shepherd K9, growled low, ready to leap into action. Mark's eyes scanned the thick snowstorm, his thoughts racing. The soldiers had to be close. Keen was persistent. He'd stop at nothing to get what he wanted. But Mark wouldn't let him. Not without a fight. Not without making sure Maya and Ruth were safe. His mind flashed back to the promise he had made to Maya, to her father, the promise to protect her, to bring her to safety no matter the cost. Her soft, trembling voice asking, "Please don't send me back," still echoed in his mind. He couldn't fail her. As if on cue, Keen's men appeared from the shadows of the storm. There were more of them this time. Mark counted at least 6 soldiers, all heavily armed, their rifles raised, their eyes scanning the trees. They were closing in. Mark's chest tightened. He was outnumbered, his ammunition was nearly gone, and his body ached with exhaustion. But there was one thing that still worked in his favor. Time. The soldiers moved forward, encircling him. The wind blew harder now, swirling the snow and making it harder to see, but Mark knew he couldn't waste any more time. He needed to make this count. He turned to Rex. "Stay close," he whispered. The K9's ears perked and the dog growled, its teeth bared, prepared for the inevitable. There was no fear in its eyes, just loyalty. Mark moved swiftly, ducking behind a tree for cover as the first soldier took a shot at him. The bullet whizzed past him, missing by mere inches. He fired back, his aim true, hitting the soldier in the chest. The man collapsed to the snow with a grunt. But there was no time to celebrate. Mark was already moving, ducking behind another tree, the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow drawing closer. The soldiers were relentless, each one trained to take down their target without hesitation. Another soldier aimed his rifle at Mark, but Rex was already there, leaping forward, knocking the soldier to the ground. The K9's jaws clamped down on the man's arm, holding him in place, forcing him to drop his weapon. Mark didn't hesitate. He fired once more, hitting the second soldier in the shoulder. The man staggered back, but he wasn't out of the fight. He raised his rifle again, aiming directly at Mark's head. "Not today," Mark muttered, sprinting toward the soldier and knocking him down with a swift strike. The man's rifle skidded away, and Mark used his last bit of strength to shove him into the snow, pinning him down. Rex was still fighting, tearing through the remaining soldiers with the same fierce loyalty that had kept him alive. But Mark could feel the tide turning. He had no more ammunition. His body was slowing down, his vision blurry, his strength draining with each passing second. He could hear the sound of more soldiers arriving, their boots crunching against the snow, their voices shouting orders. Mark's heart raced, but he didn't give in to the panic that threatened to consume him. "We need to move," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "We need to keep going." But just as Mark turned to run, a sharp pain exploded in his leg. He stumbled, falling to the ground, his vision flashing with white-hot agony. He had been shot. The soldier who had managed to sneak up behind him had fired, and now the blood flowed freely from the wound. Mark gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay conscious. He couldn't afford to pass out. Not now. He had to keep moving. "Mark!" Ruth's voice broke through the chaos. He turned his head to see her running toward him, holding the baby tightly in her arms, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm fine," he rasped, though he knew it wasn't true. "Get Maya to safety." "Now," but Ruth shook her head. "We're not leaving you behind." Not again. Mark's heart swelled with gratitude for Ruth, for the strength in her that he knew he couldn't match. She was right. They couldn't leave him behind. He wouldn't leave them behind either. "Please," he whispered, his voice weak but firm. "Go." Ruth hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her expression hardening. "We'll be back for you." "I promise." As she turned to lead Maya and the baby deeper into the trees, Mark pushed himself up, trying to ignore the pain that threatened to overwhelm him. He didn't have much time. The soldiers were regrouping, and the sound of their footsteps drew closer. They wouldn't stop until they had them. Mark dragged himself to his feet, his vision spinning. He barely registered the rifle in his hands. Everything had become a blur of pain and cold, the world shrinking down to a single goal: survival. He looked toward the trees where Ruth had disappeared, his thoughts only on her and Maya. They were so close. He couldn't let them down, not now, not ever. But as Mark stumbled toward the trees, he felt the weight of his body pulling him down, his knees buckling under the strain. The storm was closing in, the wind biting into his skin, and Keen's men were getting closer. Then from somewhere behind him he heard a faint voice, small and desperate. "Daddy's not dead, right?" Mark froze. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His heart twisted in his chest as he turned around, the bitter cold filling his lungs as he tried to find his voice. He could barely stand, let alone answer her question. But deep down, he knew what she was asking. Was he really going to die here? Was the promise he made to her going to fall apart in the face of overwhelming odds? Mark's breath caught in his throat, and he whispered, barely audible, "I swear, Maya." "I'll bring him back. I'll bring you both home." The storm howled around them, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Mark could hear a new resolve forming in his chest. No matter what happened next, he wouldn't let this end like this. He couldn't. Mark's world was spinning, each breath harder to take as the cold clung to his body, the blood seeping through his jacket and staining the snow beneath him. His vision blurred, but the thought of Maya, Ruth, and the promise he had made to them kept him moving, even as his legs trembled beneath him. "I won't fail her. Not now." The sound of Keen's men closing in seemed to be everywhere, the crunch of boots on the snow growing louder, but Mark pushed it aside. His mind was focused on the only thing that mattered now, getting Maya and Ruth to safety. He stumbled forward, leaning against a tree to steady himself, his rifle still clutched in his hand, though his grip was growing weaker. The storm howled around him, the wind cutting through his clothes like knives, but he barely noticed. His only thought was on getting them out of here. A voice shouted from behind him, Keen, that same cold, mocking voice. "You really think you're going to get away, Sergeant?" "You're running out of time." Mark didn't respond. There was no point. Keen didn't care. They were just pieces to him, disposable. But Maya wasn't disposable. She had become the reason he fought, the reason he kept going even when every part of his body begged him to stop. The K9, Rex, growled low, its hackles raised, as it positioned itself between Mark and the approaching soldiers. Mark's heart swelled with gratitude for the dog's loyalty. Rex would fight until the end, but they couldn't afford a fight. They needed to run. He looked toward the trees again, and there, just ahead, he could see Ruth and Maya, the two of them moving cautiously through the snow, staying low to avoid being spotted. They were so close, and yet they were so far away. Mark's leg buckled again, and he collapsed to one knee. The pain from the gunshot wound was unbearable, but it was the cold, the sheer exhaustion that was starting to drown him. He fought to keep his eyes open, his grip on the rifle slipping. "No," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible. Not yet. But Keen wasn't going to give them the time they needed. He was too close now. Mark could feel it. The soldiers were closing in on all sides. There was no way out, no more time to run. The sounds of the storm, the wind howling, the crunch of snow under boots, all of it seemed to fade for a moment as Mark's mind honed in on the two people who mattered most, Maya and Ruth. "Get them out of here, Ruth," Mark whispered, his voice barely a rasp. "Keep her safe." No matter what Ruth's eyes flicked back to him, a silent acknowledgement. She wasn't going to leave him behind, but she knew the truth too. There was no choice anymore. Rex barked, its deep growl snapping Mark from his thoughts. The first soldier had reached them, his rifle raised, his eyes narrowed as he spotted Mark. "Stay back," Mark commanded, raising his own rifle, aiming at the soldier. "Get down," he shouted to Ruth. Ruth didn't need to be told twice. She dropped to the snow, covering Maya with her body as she pulled the baby tighter into her arms. Mark's eyes never left the soldier in front of him. His heart was pounding in his chest, but there was no time to stop. There was only time for one last push. Mark fired, hitting the soldier square in the chest. The man fell backward into the snow, but more were coming, circling around, their weapons drawn. The sound of boots on the snow was getting closer. Mark could hear the soldiers whispering, yelling commands to each other, but all of it was muffled by the roaring storm and the blood pounding in his ears. With his remaining strength, Mark pushed himself up, firing again, but he was too slow. One of the soldiers hit him in the shoulder and Mark cried out in pain, his body jerking back. The force of the shot sent him stumbling to the ground. Rex moved like lightning, knocking the nearest soldier aside, sinking its teeth into the man's arm and forcing him down. Mark watched through a haze of pain as the dog tore into the soldier's uniform, but he couldn't focus on the fight anymore. Mark's vision blurred again as he tried to push himself up, but the pain in his shoulder and leg was overwhelming. He could feel the blood oozing from the wound, his body going cold, the world spinning faster and faster. He wasn't going to make it out of this. But Maya and Ruth, they could, they had to. "Go!" Mark shouted through clenched teeth, his voice barely audible. "Now! Don't stop!" Ruth hesitated for a moment, but she was smart. She knew there was no time to argue. With one last look at Mark, she nodded and began to pull Maya away, her footsteps leaving tracks in the snow as they disappeared into the trees. Mark didn't watch them go. His eyes were locked on Keen's soldiers, his rifle raised, ready for whatever came next. The K9 was still fighting, but there were too many. Mark had given them their chance. Now it was his turn to fight to the last breath. Keen stepped forward, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "You thought you could protect her? You thought you could keep her safe?" Mark didn't respond. He was beyond words now. His rifle was trembling in his hands, but he wasn't going to give up. Not yet. Before Keen could move closer, Mark fired one last shot, hitting the man's side. The bullet didn't kill him, but it sent Keen stumbling backward, his face contorted in anger. "You're out of time, Sergeant," Keen sneered. "You should have given up." Mark couldn't hear the rest of Keen's words over the pounding in his chest, the sharp pain in his side. He couldn't feel the cold anymore, couldn't feel anything except the resolve that had built up inside him, inside his bones. And then, from the distance, Mark heard the sound of Rex's bark fading into the storm. The K9 had done its job. He had done his, but Maya, Ruth, they had to survive. Mark slumped against the tree, his rifle slipping from his hands. He could still hear Maya's voice, soft and desperate, calling for her father. The storm raged on, but in that moment, Mark's final thought was that he had kept his promise to her. The world felt distant, like it was slipping away with each heartbeat. Mark's vision blurred at the edges, the cold, the pain, and the fatigue creeping up on him. But in the midst of it, there was one thing that kept him tethered to this world, the sound of Maya's voice, soft and broken, whispering through the chaos. "Daddy's not dead, please don't leave me." His grip on his rifle loosened, and his mind swirled with exhaustion, but the need to protect Maya and Ruth kept him anchored in the present. The storm raged around him, and the blizzard was no longer just a storm of snow. It felt like the world itself was battling him for one last chance to let go. Mark had no strength left to stand, and yet his body still held on, as if fighting for the promise he had made. For Maya. His vision darkened, and the cold seeped deeper into his bones. But then, through the haze of pain, a distant voice rang out from the trees. "Mark." It was Ruth's voice. It was faint, but it was real. And it was the sound he had been waiting for. Maya and Ruth were still alive. They had made it to the trees. "They're safe," he thought with the last bit of clarity his mind could manage. His heart, once heavy with fear and uncertainty, found a small moment of peace. The storm howled around him, and he could hear the faint sound of Keen's men still advancing, but they were too far now. His job was done. He had kept his promise. And though he hadn't been able to finish the fight himself, he knew that Maya and Ruth had the chance to escape, had the chance to survive. He could feel the K9, Rex, at his side, still standing guard, its loyal presence a last comfort in his fading world. The dog had been with him through everything. Mark had always known that Rex was more than just a companion. He was family. As the pain in his side intensified, Mark's head drooped, and he couldn't hold on any longer. His thoughts turned to Ruth, to Maya, to the life he had promised to protect. He had done everything he could. He had kept the most important promise he had ever made. And in his final moments, Mark could hear the soft rustling of snow in the wind. The sounds of the forest, distant and muffled by the storm, became like a lullaby in his fading consciousness. He didn't see it when Ruth finally found him, her footsteps soft but urgent as she rushed toward him, cradling Maya close to her chest. But he could feel her presence, her warmth in the cold, and he knew she was there. Mark couldn't speak. He couldn't even lift his head, but he felt the warmth of Ruth's hand on his cheek, her fingers trembling with fear and relief. She knelt beside him, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Mark." "No. No, please don't go." But Mark couldn't answer. His body was giving up, the battle was over, and the world around him was slipping away. But in that moment, there was peace. There was peace in knowing that he had done everything he could. Maya's voice reached him next. "Daddy?" Mark couldn't respond. His heart fluttered in his chest, and though he wanted to speak, he couldn't find the strength. But just before the darkness took him, before the storm drowned out everything else, he felt the soft touch of Maya's hand, delicate and warm. She was holding his hand, just like she had when they first met. "I'm here, Maya," he thought, though the words never left his lips. "I'm here, and I'll always be with you." The storm continued to rage, but for Mark the world had grown quiet. His body, broken and battered, finally gave way, but his spirit found peace in the promise he had kept. Maya and Ruth were safe. And that was all that mattered. As Mark's final breath left his body, the world around him seemed to fall still. The storm continued to howl, the snow falling in thick, heavy sheets, but for a moment there was a profound silence, a peaceful stillness in the cold wilderness. Ruth looked down at Mark's still form, her tears mixing with the falling snow. Her heart ached with the loss, but she knew in her soul that he had done everything to protect them. She had witnessed it in his every action, in his every decision. He had kept his promise, and that was the greatest gift he could give them. Maya stood beside Ruth, holding her teddy bear tightly, her small hand wrapped around her mother's. She didn't fully understand the weight of what had happened, but she could feel the loss. She could feel the absence of the man who had given her everything. And in her heart, she knew that Mark's love, his sacrifice, would never fade. "Mommy, is he gone?" Maya asked softly, her voice trembling. Ruth knelt down beside her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But he's with us, always." In our hearts, Ruth held Maya close, the baby nestled in her arms, her body trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. She had lost so much, but she had gained so much too. In the midst of the loss, in the aftermath of everything they had endured, Ruth knew one thing for certain. Maya's future was still waiting for her, and she would raise her with all the love and strength Mark had left behind. Ruth looked out into the snowstorm, the path forward unclear, but she knew they would continue on, for Mark, for the memory of his sacrifice, for the future that was still worth fighting for. "I promise, Mark," Ruth whispered into the storm, her voice strong despite the tears. "We'll keep going. We'll keep going for you," the storm raged on. But for Ruth, the storm inside her had calmed. She had lost, but she had also gained, and in that she would find her strength to carry on.